to explore the fragile fault lines between the living and the dead, between the enormous loss of tragedy and the reparative reconciliations that mark Shakespeare's post-tragic plays, forgiveness, acknowledgement, recognition, repair. All of these gestures somehow tap into the state of in-betweenness, and Professor Beckwith reminds us they are all deeply related to language, to what words do and how they fail, to the realities they construct and the gaps they bridge. So it is fitting that this year landed squarely between international celebrations of Shakespeare's birth and his death, that we are mindful of the Shakespeare born to a working-class glover in Stratford-upon-Avon, as well as the Shakespeare who cursed anyone who dare move his bones, buried in Holy Trinity Church. But we focus intently on Shakespeare and the human, on all of those various ages of man that lie between the infant mewling and puking in his mother's arms and that state of second childhood and near oblivion. It is a splendid delight to introduce to you Sarah Beckwith, who will share some of her reflections with us on Shakespeare and the importance of being human in her talk, Shakespeare, Tragedy, and Possessing Language. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Beckwith.
Lovely, thank you.
Thanks
so
for being
much.
here.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and I too would like to thank Elizabeth and Liz, wherever she is, for bringing me here, and of course Jay, who I had the great delight and pleasure of getting to know Jay, I think, was it 3 years ago? 3 years ago when I was doing a seminar at the Folger, and Jay was a member of that seminar. We met, I think it was about 10 weekends, a group of us coming from all over the place to be together every Friday morning. It was a magical time for me, a wonderful group of people, Jay's contribution to that seminar was always stellar, so you're lucky to have him, you students here, as I'm sure you know. I have a short epigraph. It's from Stanley Cavell's great book, The Claim of Reason. Can everybody hear me all right? Great. Being human is the power to grant being human. Something about flesh and blood elicits this grant from us, and something about flesh and blood can also repel it. For a while, in the Literary Academy, the word human never appeared without its little straitjacket of scare quotes, as if those would save us from the fear of giving voice to the word. It's been the dogma of the Literary Academy for some time that talk of the human automatically invited universalism or essentialism, that it was automatically exclusionary and implied an arrogant presumption of the place of humanity in the world and in nature. The savage, institutional, economic, social and political structures and habits that sustain such arrogance are rightly to be eschewed. And I don't underestimate the long unfinished labour of contesting an insular yet viciously successful hegemony. It's perhaps no wonder, though, that we're troubled so much for the word for our kind, the human, for we live in a society that sometimes seems incapable of knowing what a human life is worth. John Berger suggests that it is because it cannot afford to. If it did, he says, it would either have to dismiss this knowledge, and with it dismiss all pretenses to democracy and so become totalitarian, or it would have to take account of this knowledge and revolutionize itself. Either way, it would be transformed. Then perhaps our scare quotes around the human are an inchoate hedging, helping us to avoid our aspirations to be human, which is of course a task, not a given. In that task we live, as Stanley Cavell is fond of saying, between acknowledgement and avoidance. But in fact, who are we trying to scare away with those scare quotes? The scare quotes, a marked feature of literary theory in the height of its post-structuralist grip, were supposed to put an ironic distance from the word protected by the little punctuation marks. Now, the first usage of scare quotes is 1960. The Oxford English Dictionary describes scare quotes as quotation marks used around a word or phrase when they are not required, thereby eliciting attention or doubts. Scare quotes then are not so much a piece of grammar, but rather a kind of rhetorical manoeuvre to suggest that the very usage of the word is a problem without this ironic distancing. When I say legitimate rape, I want to put it in scare quotes because I do not share Todd Aiken's dangerous lunacy. In that instance, I'm showing that I'm using Aiken's language and not mine, so the quotation marks are in this instance citational. There, the distancing seems fully appropriate. But whose particular usage am I distancing myself from when I say the human and make those little signals with my hands? Now, those who used to do this so frequently might say, well, I'm distancing myself from those who are assuming that the white Western liberal subject speaks for the human. I'm showing that I understand this to be a usurpation. Only I think the two cases are not analogous. Aiken's term legitimate rape shows that he does not understand what rape is, whereas the person distancing himself from the putatively haughty humanist or the unwitting sexist or racist is relying on a shared understanding of the human when he thinks he is only guarding against one usage of that term. In that sense, he's not quite done what he thinks he's done. The human is not the haughty humanist term the way that legitimate rape was Todd Aiken's crazy solecism. He has in fact depended on the shared understanding of this term and then used the scare quotes to try to highlight a reduced usage of it. In this sense, his scare quotes are not citational at all. So who is the scare quoter distancing himself from? What is he scared of? And who is he scaring off? The rejection of all talk of the human has left the humanities enfeebled and almost defenceless against the combined but formidable onslaughts of the corporate university, the business model of education, and its own consequential abandonment of the common reader. Shakespeare offers us a way of talking about the human, not as he invented it, as Harold Bloom says, and not as either a metaphysically grounded or biological entity distinguished as such by the protocols of science, not as a definition that excludes non-rational creatures, but as a form of life to which we are fated. He understood the importance of being human, in Cora Diamond's wonderful phrase, as in our most basic and our most sophisticated linguistic and ethical competencies. In particular, his tragedies are involved in an exploration of how it is internal to being human to wish to escape from this condition, and the cravings, ruses, compulsions, the costs and consequence of this avoidance. Now, the invocation of Shakespeare is no panacea, no guarantee against these corrosions, absent a patient description of how we take on the exposure and risk of human form and human expressiveness individually. So this paper will explore the idea of a common humanity in Shakespeare and its home in mutual responsiveness, recognition and responsibility, but also repudiation and the rejection of each to each. In particular, I'm going to be pursuing the idea of remorse as a form of conviction. That's the form of conviction are Ludwig Wittgenstein's terms. And I'm going to be focusing on Shakespeare's extraordinary tragedy Macbeth. I'm particularly interested here in the way that the Scottish play, when approached in a certain spirit, helps us both sharpen and deepen our understanding of, and indeed through, remorse. Such specifications, while not working through arguments, are nevertheless conceptual. They help us to get a grip on questions of action and human agency that are all too liable, sometimes in philosophical hands, to become dry, narrow, and attenuated. Shakespeare cherishes the human, and this is nowhere more obvious than in his profound analysis of the process of dehumanization. I'm going to ask again at the end of this paper whether this might be the right name for what is happening to Macbeth, but I'll let that stand for now. So the first section is called Losing the Name of Action. We can smell trouble when at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 7, Macbeth refers to the imminent murder of Duncan as it, and he surrounds his it by a conditional, if, and more, a subjunctive, were, if it were done. It is as if he imagines the future precipitously as the past, moreover a past in which a deed has been done with no apparent doer. In a few short words, he has removed himself from the picture. Against the contorted rhythm of Macbeth's obfuscations, Shakespeare sounds the beat of the deed. Done, done, done. 3 times in 1.5 lines, with the last sounding with an offbeat stress. And then another conditional, followed by a string of complex evasions. Now the murder is an assassination, and he's imagining a world where deeds have no consequences. Since this cannot be the world of human action, Macbeth, I want to argue, is denaturing himself, imagining he is more or less than human, and exiling himself from the shared meanings on which his words depend. In her brilliant book, Hannah Arendt, the book The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt discussed action as necessarily irreversible, unpredictable, and boundless. To do and to suffer are opposite sides of the same coin, she claims, and an act begins a story whose consequences are boundless, caught up in the reactions and responses of others, who are moreover unpredictable, whose full meaning can reveal itself only when it has ended, as she says. That a deed once performed cannot be taken back is what tragedy focuses on, the irreversibility of action. So now, to go on with the speech I was quoting from, in the nasty compactness of surcease, another evasion, and success, Macbeth tries to short-circuit the very logic of action. He is imagining a deed, this blow, that would be entirely sufficient to itself, bringing with it purely the consequences he desires. So the deed would be his alone to define, carved out of the world of the responses of others. And now Macbeth talks on, emphasising here that but this blow might be the be-all and end-all here. That this is a crazy, cockeyed impossibility is shown in the unstoppable spill over to the next line, but here, upon this bank and shoal of time. Macbeth is tutoring himself in the denial of his own agency, in the avoidance of the very nature of the deed he's about to commit, and what that deed makes him. In separating his own agency from the deed, in denying the very nature of the deed he's committing, he is traducing the very nature of human action. For Macbeth is here denying some very basic facts of human nature, facts not fixed by custom or convention, facts so obvious that they might go unnoticed, such as Stanley Cavell says, such as, for example, the fact that the realization of human intention requires action, that action requires movement, that movement involves consequences we had not intended, that our knowledge and ignorance of ourselves and of others depends upon the way our minds are expressed and distorted in word and deed and passion, that actions have histories. Now, when we next see Macbeth speaking alone, we see him apparently in the grip of an apparition. Is the dagger he sees before him a fatal vision that is sensible to feeling, or is it a dagger of the mind? Whatever it is, the dagger is a thou given personality, intimacy even. It is a thing that addresses him and that he addresses. It's marshalling him along the path that he was already travelling. Thou marshallest me the way I was going. He doesn't need a marshal then, he was already travelling that path. But the marshal is a companion, a guide, and it takes off the edge of his agency, his responsibility to be guided in this way. Macbeth, I want to argue here, is turning his action into behaviour. I go, and it is done. Once again, he elides his own agency in the act, imagining that he is drawn by the imaginary dagger, instructed by the whole of nature itself, and finally summoned by the bell which invites him to heaven or hell. James Calderwood has brilliantly said of these lines, "The whole speech marvellously illustrates the workings of a self-protective consciousness as it projects its inner impulses to create a behaviouristic world to whose stimuli it can then respond." This slip from action to behaviour is important, for in representing his action as a response to a set of stimuli, the bell, the world of nature, the dagger itself, he begins to think of them as causal, and he abandons the entire domain of responsibility, which is internally connected to what human action is, and where talk is properly of reasons, not causes. For we don't know what action has been done without understanding the intentions with which it's done, without an answer, potential or actual, to the question, why did you do that? In the Prima Secunda of Thomas Aquinas' great Summa, Aquinas contemplates human actions proper to man as man. Those actions, he says, are properly called actions which proceed from a deliberate will. And if any other actions are found in man, they are called actions of a man, but not properly human actions, since they are not proper to a man as man. An action, according to the philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe in her modern classic Intentions, is purposive and can always be answered by the question, why are you doing that? Notice here that the claim is by no means that the intention controls the meaning of the action. As an editor, translator and friend of Wittgenstein's, Anscombe was hardly likely to make that blunder. For Aquinas, what follows from his deeply Aristotelian understanding of action is that we are the deed's creature. What Macbeth is blinding himself to then is the shaping role of the agent's deeds in forming, in building a character. In denying the natural logic of man and woman and deed, Macbeth is denying his own humanity. The dagger marshals him then as if in a dream. Soon he'll be melodramatically conjuring himself as Tarquin and pleading with the very earth not to respond to him. The path to murder, to regicide, is to deny all responsiveness to the world and the world to you. Macbeth requires the earth's deafness. Hear not my steps, which way they walk, and the world's darkness. Let not light see my black and deep desires, as a presage to his act. And he seeks the world's blindness and indifference as he covets the darkness which he imagines will render his deeds invisible. And in so doing, the very physical integrity of his person cracks up. His eye will wink at his hand. The invisibility to himself that he covets, call it soul blindness, will result not merely in a blackening out of self, to know my deed, 'twere best not know myself, but an intense isolation and self-deadening. It is a presage of the deadening that will come at the end of the play. There, surcease and success a pleasantly tuneful interlude there. Surcease and success have reached a different accommodation. There, the succession of days, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, annihilates novelty. The evil man's world is a solipsistic world. He can take things from others, but he can receive nothing from them. Were Macbeth to be able to do what he desires, to extricate his murder from all consequences save that of his own succession to the crown, to define the exact limits and contours of the act unilaterally, it would not be human action. And so, in Shakespeare's understanding, he has to deny and avoid his own humanity in order to perform actions that logically must have the consequences of human actions. Macbeth is beginning to have merely the illusion of sense. And this is why his nihilism at the end of the play is the logical endpoint, for he has stopped making any sense at all. He has stupefied himself. How does he stupefy himself? We witness this process immediately after, as well as before the murder. When Macbeth describes how he could not say Amen when he overhears the prayers of the grooms he is about to murder, Lady Macbeth responds, "These deeds must not be thought after these ways, so it will make us mad." Macbeth, being afraid to think what he has done, must not think at all. When he hears that Macduff has fled to England, he wishes entirely to eradicate any gap there might be between the conception and the execution of a deed, such that the very firstlings of my heart shall be the firstlings of my hand, be it thought and done. His wish is to eradicate thought altogether, to remove the very possibility that there could be a conceivable answer to the question, why are you doing that? He renders himself thoughtless. This is the sweet, oblivious antidote that he ministers to himself. Closely allied to his willful thoughtfulness, his self-stupefaction, is his desire for isolation. We will keep ourselves till supper time alone. "Why do you keep alone?" asks Lady Macbeth, who has encouraged his oblivion, his thoughtlessness. Things without all remedy should be without regard. He tells her that there shall be done a deed of dreadful note. Again, his use of the passive tense averts his own agency in the murders he has ordered. To her inquiries about what it is that's to be done, he asks not for her consultation, but for her applause after the fact. "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck, till thou applaud the deed." And his next address, turning away from his wife to the night, is to the night, to blind the day, to scarf up its eye to future actions. Lady Macbeth is reduced to being a retrospective cheerleader for nameless, authorless deeds, deeds he will not and cannot now share, because to share them in prospect or retrospect might be to name them. And how, innocent of the knowledge, could she applaud the deed? Macbeth is, of course, removing any possibility of judgment and understanding from her ability to discern his action. Once again, we see the separation of reason from will, the denaturing of action, and the concomitant destruction of intimacy and community. Wishing not to know his deed or his self, he can scarcely afford the risk of human company, the risk of being known by anyone else. "It will have blood," he says in one of his most chilling speeches. What is the it? He's now conceived himself as wading in the river of blood so deep that to continue across is all the same as to return, negating the point of action to a bloody and terrible sameness to whose horror he is nonetheless numb. His deeds must be acted ere they may be scanned. In what sense are they human acts at all in his diseased and confused imagination? So what I've been trying to suggest here is that Shakespeare is showing us a mind losing the concept of human action. But Shakespeare hasn't lost this concept. How else can he keep its contours so firmly and indeed so relentlessly before us? And how might it be recovered? So the next section is called Lady Macbeth's Cry. The recovery of the concept of deed and doer in the world of human action may come through remorse, whose characteristic voice is, "My God, what have I done?" Or it is Lady Macbeth's terrible cry uttered while sleepwalking, which I can only now and forever remember here in the shattering, soul-searching, soul-touching cry of Judi Dench in her rendering of this scene. Lady Macbeth has conjured the stopping up of the access and passage to remorse so that the compunctious visitings of nature cannot shake her murderous purpose, back in Act 1, Scene 5. But we can only feel remorse over what has the power to haunt us, and Lady Macbeth will feel her remorse once the access and passage to it is unstopped, in the unremitting horror of her awakening memory. There she will feel, as Emily Dickinson says in her brilliant poem on remorse, a presence of departed acts at window and at door. It is in remorse that the doer recognises the one wronged in all his or her particularity, in the recognition of what she has done. Remorse is to be distinguished from shame, in that the focus is unerringly on the reality of the one wronged, not in his or her general humanity, but precisely in his or her uniqueness and irreplaceability. In remorse, one recognises what one has become simultaneously with the particular reality of the other. Raymond Gaita puts it this way: a certain sense of her victim's individuality is internal to a murderer's understanding of the moral significance of what she did. That, he says, is part of what it is to be aware of the reality of another human being. Now, Raymond Gaita is not saying that we feel remorse because we see that something is wrong. He is saying that our natural dispositions to remorse and to pity are one of the determinants of our concept of remorse and indeed of what being a human being is. Gaita makes the analogy to what he calls Wittgenstein's astonishingly radical remark that pity is a form of conviction that someone is in pain. Pity, he's suggesting here, is not a psychological state, but as he puts it, normative for the description of the forms of our indifference to the suffering of others. We know pity not epistemically, but through our most basic responses in healing, binding, wounding, hurting, comforting, and crying, in the fact that we look into someone's face when binding his wounds. In remorse, says Ray Gaita, in a wonderful indictment of what passes for moral theory, sometimes in philosophy, he is not haunted by his principles, he is not haunted by the moral law, he is not haunted by the fact that he did what he ought not to have done. He is haunted by the particular human being he has murdered. Again, haunted is the right word. In Lady Macbeth's night walking scene, the passages to remorse are utterly unstopped. She's haunted nightly by the old man who had so much blood in him, by the Thane of Fife's wife. She is haunted by them. It's the picture of the human, not general at all, but this particular one, in his or her uniqueness and irreplaceability. How is she haunted by her deeds? How then does her remorse bring in the reality of the other? It cannot quite be said that it is a conscience awakening to what she has done. It is perhaps rather a despairing and permanent redoing of the act itself, only now the words she said, "a little water clears us of this deed," are ironized by the carelessness with which she said them then, with their irreversibility, their boundless echo in her poor tormented soul. What's done cannot be undone. In that thought, she can only now undo herself. For that undoing, announced by the offstage cry of women, there can be no time. She should have died hereafter, Macbeth says. Remorse, then, is one of the ways in which the concept of human action is recovered, for it is in remorse that bitingly, agonizingly, the very contours of the terrible deed, the very significance of the act performed, re-emerge in the sense of the particular harm done. Ray Gaita, to quote him one more time, has said that remorse is a disciplined remembrance of the moral significance of what we did. So the doer, the deed, and the one harmed come into focus all together, inextricably and mutually. The terrible recognition of what we have become is the necessary condition of the recognition of the evil we have done. If remorse has to do with understanding yourself and your action, what you have done to someone else, it's because it involves a self not carved out of its own self-definition, its own will, but rather an understanding that your actions are involved with the life of others, subject to their representation, an understanding also that those actions define you and that you are the deed's creature. The deed is not your creature. So as I've just hinted in that quotation, she should have died hereafter, there's no time to mourn Lady Macbeth, because Macbeth has abolished time. He's assimilated himself to a timeless will, a will which has anaesthetized its own reasons and rationales and replaced them with causes it experiences compulsions extrinsic to his own will. To refuse remorse, as Rowan Williams has said, is to refuse to think what it is to be a subject changing according to processes and interactions outside my own will. So the refusal of remorse may well involve a vast overestimation of the role of the will. Macbeth, I think, shows us that picture of the will as murderous. The stopping and unstopping of remorse is Shakespeare's way of retrieving the very concept of human action from a murderous will, Macbeth's, but also from a picture of the will that is itself murderous and bound up with violence. And the next section is called Losing Our Concepts. In charting in Macbeth the internal relations between the concepts of action and remorse, the danger of losing the name of human action and recovering it again in the disciplined remembrance of past deeds, in which remembrances the doer perceives himself painfully as the evil doer he has become by virtue of his deeds. In charting the play's contours in this respect, I wish to allude to the notion of conceptual amnesia. Now, the title of the section that I was reading to you earlier, Losing the Name of Action, comes obviously from Hamlet. It comes at the end of the most famous soliloquy of all in that play, To Be or Not to Be. We might describe at least part of this famous soliloquy as Hamlet trying to force himself to be more like Macbeth, as he entertains the idea that conscience makes cowards of us, turning awry enterprises of great pith and moment, so that they lose the name of action, so that they are impossible to act on, so that they can't properly be called actions. That play too is an astonishing exploration of action, who authors it or seeks to do it, how it escapes intention, how death supersedes all revenging plots, in the face of which, finally, only readiness is all. But I've borrowed the phrase to suggest the work of conceptual amnesia. This is central to Thomas Fowle's recent book, Minding the Modern, and it may be said to have its roots in Iris Murdoch's pithy and brilliant essay Against Dryness. But it's also beautifully elaborated in the work of the philosopher Cora Diamond, and especially in her important essay, Losing Your Concepts. Iris Murdoch says in Against Dryness, "We have suffered a general loss of concepts, the loss of a moral and political vocabulary. We no longer see man against a background of values, of realities which transcend him. We picture man as a brave, naked will, surrounded by an equally comprehended empirical world." Now, I don't have time here to explore the differences in conceptual amnesia as it's posited differently in the work, say, of Iris Murdoch or of Alistair MacIntyre, or do more than allude to the riches on offer in Thomas Fowle, my colleague's extraordinary book. Both Cora Diamond and Nicholas Forsberg distinguish the way in which concepts can be lost. They can be lost historically. Things change in such a way that we no longer understand certain ways of life. So they can be lost historically. But they can be lost philosophically too, as Wittgenstein argues when, for example, he shows how our conceptions of inner life have been radically misconstrued. For Iris Murdoch, conceptual loss involves our loss of conceptual realities, one that derives from a conflict between ourselves and the pictures of the good life we strive to emulate. We strive, she thinks, to become the naked choosing wills pictured in our moral philosophy. Murdoch wanted us to see that moral agency and our reasons for action were not properly conceived in terms of choice. That often choice is irrelevant because someone's very being cannot conceive a choice where others might so conceive it, or because the very formulation of something as choice is already morally degrading. Further, as Nicholas Forsberg has recently shown, the conception of human freedom as choice, the picture of the naked will in a supermarket of options, strips us of our reality and makes our attempts at self-understanding merely regional. The picture of the human as a naked will makes it hard to see and easy to forget the intricacy of the relations of the connections between conceptions of action, remorse, evil, and the central way in which our modes of describing and misdescribing what we do are bound up with our self-understanding. I've borrowed the phrase from Hamlet, losing the name of action, to show Macbeth's conceptual amnesia. Macbeth has to work hard to stupefy himself, to dull himself to the concept of human action. By imagining deeds without succession, as a very deep pun in this play, he's both denaturing the shared sense of what an action comes to, its reality, and at the same time losing his self-understanding in one and the same thought. we tend to lose an understanding of the world and an understanding of ourselves together. If he were to know his deed, it were best then not to know himself, right there as an acknowledgement of the horror of regicide and murder. But he cannot know his deed without knowing himself, that is, without understanding what his action entails. Shakespeare, I think, shows us the very process of conceptual amnesia in Macbeth's mind, as he shows how he loses his grip on both self, world, and action. In Macbeth, what we do, our actions, come under myriad descriptions, and these descriptions define us because they articulate the positions we're prepared to take and what we hold ourselves responsible for. The way we see the world is as revelatory of us as of the world we see, respond to, and describe in everyday life and fiction. In Remorse, the deed, the doer, and what is done are realised together in a biting retrospective recognition. That is why seeing the shape of evil and the shape of love are coterminous. And that is why what remorse shows us is an encounter with the reality of the ethical. That's also why the play as a whole, I think, doesn't share the nihilism it exposes in its central protagonist, but rather sees that pointlessness, that signification of precisely nothing, the tale only of sound, fury, and idiocy, as the logical end of the extinction of action, and this precisely not in a moralistic way, but through our pity in what Macbeth has become. What we need, Iris Murdoch suggests, against simplistic ideas of freedom of the will and the will's agency in action, is a renewed sense of the difficulty and complexity of the moral life and opacity of persons. She finds literature a good home for the exploration of concepts where vision is enlarged. Seeing what is most precious to us is a task I see at the heart of Shakespeare's late tragedies. There, what is precious is only realised through a recognition of loss. So the last section is called The Thane of Fife Had a Wife, What is Most Precious to Us. I take those terms, of course, what is most precious to us, from Macduff's response to Malcolm when he's received the news of his wife and children's death. I want to dwell on this response for a little bit and rehearse what Macduff is responding to in the play. This will show how the play continually refines and holds open to view not how to choose between different actions, what ought to be done here, to cry like a woman or fight like a man, but rather hold a sense, a vision in Iris Murdoch's terms, of what is precious to us. It helps us see that moral judgment is about the apprehension of a world apt for valuing, rather than a choice between different values. To explore Macduff's response, we need to appreciate what it is a response to. In Michael Boyd's recent Royal Shakespeare Company production of Macbeth at Stratford-upon-Avon in 2012, the moral centre of the play is the murder of Lady Macduff's children at the castle in Fife. Just a really quite fascinating production in many ways. Now, this scene is remarkably, or was sometimes cut in 18th and 19th century productions. And it's often, frankly, produced in a highly sentimental fashion. The boy, Lady Macduff's precocious son, seems too sweet, and sometimes banal understandings of femininity as weak, not wise, get in the way of appreciating Lady Macduff's clear-sighted understanding of her own betrayal, isolation, and abandonment. And those sentimental visions corrupt the lucidity with which I think the scene was written. For here we encounter the courage of a young boy standing in for his father toward a wife and mother abandoned by her great warrior husband who will redeem the land. Only no such redemption is at hand. This is what it is to live in the Scotland of Macbeth. We know that Macbeth's Scotland is a land ruled by and through fear. The exchange with Ross and Lady Macduff at the beginning of this scene is vital. In the preceding scene, we've just seen Macbeth in dismay at the news of Macduff's flight, declaring that he will surprise Macduff's castle in Fife and seize his lands. Now, in the next scene, we move to Fife, and Lady Macduff is being brought the news from Ross that Macduff has fled the land. Her first question is to ask, what had he done that he should flee? And she thinks his flight is madness, that he's become a traitor to her and to her children by virtue of his fears. And to this, Ross tries out the idea that she doesn't know whether it was wisdom or fear. Lady Macduff replies that it cannot be wisdom to leave his wife, to leave his babes, his mansion and his titles in a place from whence himself does fly. For her, this is a sign that he cannot love them, for even the wren, she says, fights against the owl to protect the young ones in her nest. All is the fear, nothing is the love. A description apt for the denaturing of Scotland. Ross tries again the thought that Macduff is noble, wise and judicious, and best knows the fits of the season. But he admits that the times are cruel when we are traitors and do not know ourselves, yet know not what we fear, but float upon a wild and violent sea each way and none. Now, not enough credence is usually given to the wisdom of Lady Macduff's apprehension of what wisdom here might actually come to, against the initially bland, superficial and false consolations of Ross. And then Ross goes. And then a messenger comes in warning her to flee, and then he goes. It's left to her son to be the man, and he is, in this striking staging, the best man in the play, his actions and vision the least corrupted, his heart the purest. The scene anatomizes the effect of fear, of how liable it is to make us traitors, even when we don't know what we fear, floating each way and therefore none. To draw out the depth of Macduff's response to their slaughter, this scene needs to be free of condescension, and it needs to be as clear-sighted as Lady Macduff is within it. Macduff's response to the slaughter of his entire family and household insists on the responsibility of responsiveness. He's told by Malcolm that he must dispute it like a man. To Malcolm's morally feeble, instrumental words, "Be comforted, let's make us medicines of our great revenge," he finds it enough to comment, "He has no children." And then, "I shall do so, but I must also feel it as a man. I cannot but remember such things that were most precious to me." All Malcolm can think of is turning Macduff into the instrument of revenge against Macbeth. But Macduff is reminded of all that is precious in the world, the remembrance of which, the recovery of which, is what he thought he was fighting for, though he now, I think, realises that he might have forgotten this. Macbeth has destroyed what is most precious to him. He has destroyed what he cares about and values. So it is what is precious, what is valued, that is here enlarged, put before us to care about. Macbeth too will eventually know that he has destroyed the things he can no longer look to have, as honour, love, troops of friends. The play Macbeth puts before us an anatomy of evil whose contours can only come clear because of remorse and the subsequent revelation of the shape of harm. In so doing, it shows us what is at stake in the concept of human action, but also what gets lost by dry versions of what it is that human beings do, dry versions of the so-called dilemmas before them. And it shows us how violent and murderous are pictures of the will, absent the acknowledgement of others. Being human is aspiring to being human, says Cavell. Being human is aspiring to being human. Since it is not aspiring to being the only human, it is an aspiration on behalf of others as well. Just a final few closing words. Macbeth has not succeeded in rendering himself inhuman, but only a human being can behave inhumanly. That is why being human is not a given. Being human, as I quoted in my epigraph, is the power to grant being human. What gives us so much is the idea, says Wittgenstein, that human beings think, can feel. And his answer, of course, is Nothing, because it is not an idea. Before we reject the human, before we imagine we are post-human, we should know what it means to cherish it. We sometimes call on each other to treat each other as human beings, and we seem to need reminders. Or we say, the way she humiliated him was inhuman, or the rapist sat on her to tie up his shoelaces after he raped her, as if she was interchangeable with a log or a bench. Is there any other way to treat each other except as human? But surely we, and not the rapist either, do not need reminders of the difference between a log and a woman. Such phrases are rather a call to justice, a plea that she will fall into the realm of justice as a stone or a log does not. They are a shamed acknowledgement that it is precisely in the realm of the human that people treat each other with a cruelty likely to madden us if we contemplate it too surely. So it's perhaps too comforting a thought to imagine that tragedy is about our finiteness, about what we can't know or do as humans. If we see it that way, we can avoid our irreducible, inevitable responsibility in adopting an attitude towards each other's souls. If we follow Stanley Cavell's logic of the embeddedness of knowledge in acknowledgement and response, then the idea of our finitude might come as a relief from the perpetual burden of having to read each other, of having to express ourselves, of having to draw the connections we draw between body and soul. So tragedy, I think, is a good reminder for the humanities, because it calls us back to our irreducible role in seeing each other as human, as a task and not a given. Criticism, says Stanley Cavell, is making a work of art available to just response. If we justly respond to Shakespearean tragedy, can it help the humanities help us be humane? Thank you.